We can feel like drivers in command of our mind, believing that we make conscious decisions and direct our actions according to our will. However, upon reflection, we realize that in many cases, we simply follow an internal navigation system that goes beyond our knowledge and understanding. If we do not make an effort to understand this navigation system, how it operates, what its objectives are, and how to intervene when it leads us astray, we run the risk of wandering aimlessly, ending up in uninteresting destinations at best, and in disastrous situations at worst. Carl Jung, the 20th century Swiss psychiatrist, is possibly one of the most remarkable and skillful individuals who has ever attempted the task of exploring the interior of himself and developing a complete understanding of this intricate internal navigation system, from its deepest structure to its most superficial functioning. Jung came into the world in 1875 in Keswil, Switzerland, into a modest family headed by his father, Paul Jung, a rural pastor, and his mother, Emily Jung, a depressed woman of eccentric nature and with supposed abilities as a seer. Jung was a lonely and introverted child. From a young age, he believed that, like his mother, he had two personalities, a modern Swiss citizen and a personality more appropriate to the 17th century. Personality number one, as he called it, was a typical schoolboy who lived in his time. Personality number two was a dignified, authoritative, and influential man of the past. Although Jung was close to both parents, he was disappointed by his father's academic approach to faith. Some childhood memories left lifelong traces on him. As a child, he carved a small mannequin on the end of a wooden ruler and placed it inside a case. He added a stone that he had painted on the upper and lower halves and hid the case in the attic. He periodically returned to the mannequin, often bringing small sheets of paper with messages written in his own secret language. Later, he reflected that this ceremonial act brought him a feeling of inner peace and security. Years later, he discovered similarities between his personal experience and the practices associated with totems in indigenous cultures. He concluded that his intuitive ceremonial act was an unconscious ritual that he had practiced in a manner strikingly similar to those in distant places of which, as a young man, he knew nothing. His observations on archetypal symbols and the collective unconscious were partly inspired by these early experiences, combined with his later research. At the age of 12, shortly before the end of his first year at the Humanistic Gymnasium in Basel, Jung was pushed to the ground by another boy with such force that he momentarily lost consciousness. Then the following thought occurred to him: now you won't have to go to school. From then on, every time he walked to school or started homework, he fainted and remained at home for the next 6 months. He overheard his father speaking hurriedly to a visitor about the boy's future ability to support himself. When faced with the reality of poverty in his family, Jung realized the need for academic excellence. He entered his father's study and began studying Latin grammar. He fainted 3 more times but finally overcame the impulse and did not faint again. This event, Jung later remembered and wrote, was when he learned what a neurosis is. After completing secondary education, Jung decided to move away from the family religious tradition and chose to study medicine at the University of Basel. As Jung rose in his career and gained recognition in his field, he had the opportunity to meet one of the most influential and controversial psychologists of his time, Sigmund Freud, a figure who still retains his prominence in the history of psychology. Their initial meeting in 1907 became a marathon conversation lasting about 13 hours, beginning a solid friendship and professional collaboration. Together, they traveled, shared lectures, analyzed each other's dreams, and debated the deeper aspects of their psychological theories. As Jung grew in his own career, tensions began to arise with Freud, particularly in fundamental areas of their theories. Philosophical differences, including Jung's more mystical inclinations in contrast to Freud's more scientific approach, along with the dynamics of their relationship, eventually led to their separation in 1913. This estrangement marked a period of psychological crisis for Jung that lasted until around 1918. During this time, he became immersed in deep introspection and carried out psychological experiments on himself, exploring the darkest corners of his unconscious. This tumultuous period of transformation and inner searching eventually consolidated his own ideas about the mind and led him to embark on an independent career as a theorist in the field of psychology. Jung's main focus was to understand the psyche in its entirety and develop theories and practices to integrate all its elements, thus creating a singular and unified state of wholeness. Here, the self refers to the totality of an individual's personality, including their emotions, thoughts, and actions, a fusion of the conscious and unconscious mind. To Jung, the supreme goal of life and psychological understanding was to move towards self-realization and becoming an authentic and fully developed individual. According to him, the essential task of the human being was to bring to light the only purpose of human existence, to shine a light in the darkness of mere being. However, much of this interaction occurs in the unconscious realm, beyond our immediate awareness and control. Therefore, a significant part of our identity and motivations remains in territory that we do not actively explore. To achieve greater authenticity and wholeness, the individual must strive to make this part of the psyche conscious by integrating it into the totality of his consciousness. Jung called this process individuation. To better understand this, it is important to understand Jung's model of the psyche, which he divided into personal unconscious, consciousness, and collective unconscious. When breaking down each one of these three realms, consciousness is, as one would normally think, the realm of personal consciousness, where one explicitly and consciously identifies with oneself. At the center of this is another structure that Jung identified, and this structure is the ego. The ego is found in the center of consciousness and provides a sense of personal distinctiveness by creating the story one tells oneself about oneself to maintain continuity in one's identity. The ego expresses itself in the conscious realm through what Jung called the persona, which is the external effort of appearance that the individual actively displays to the world. However, this persona is often disconnected from the individual's true self, as they display the character one thinks or desires to be based on what the ego deems appropriate for a particular society and role, and not what is true for who the individual really is. To execute and maintain this adequate appearance and self-esteem, the ego filters various components of personal experience and being into the conscious dimension. What it filters, restricts, and represses, it sends toward the realm of the unconscious. One of Jung's most unique and profound ideas that significantly differentiates him from other psychologists is how he separated the unconscious into two different structures, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious operates similarly to previous theories from other contemporaries. Here, the unwanted aspects of our experience and being, repressed by the ego, are stored just below our everyday consciousness. Despite being hidden, these elements still exert an active influence on our conscious life. Instead, the collective unconscious is unique in Jung's approach. He postulated that it contains universal elements that have been inherited throughout human history in a manner analogous to biological evolution. According to him, the development of consciousness has been a gradual and prolonged process, similar to the development of human civilization. Although consciousness has advanced, there are still vast areas of the human mind that remain unknown and in darkness. Due to the natural tendency of each human generation to imitate and learn from the previous one, a continuous chain of psychological imitation is formed that dates back to the beginning of human history. This process creates a reservoir of psychological predispositions, structures, and memories that are inherited by each individual automatically. Jung observed this phenomenon both in his clinical practice, where he noticed recurring similarities in the unconscious of his patients, and in his historical and mythological research. In this research, he found that the symbolic motifs and themes that arose in the unconscious of his patients were also consistent in the art, myths, and literature of different cultures and historical periods, even when these cultures had no contact with each other. From Jung's perspective, these shared motifs were expressions of universal psychic structures throughout humanity, which he called archetypes. These archetypes, in his model of the psyche, form the basis of the individual personality, predisposing certain cognitive tendencies. Within the vast territory of the unconscious, Jung identified several important facets, beginning with the shadow, which encompasses all content repressed, denied, and unknown by the ego. Furthermore, within the shadow are the animus and the anima, representing the masculine qualities repressed in a woman and the feminine qualities repressed in a man. According to Jung, all these structures of the psyche interact in a dynamic process to form the center of the personality, which is defined more explicitly as the self. This self represents the authentic totality of the individual, including their desires, abilities, and true preferences. The objective of individuation, in essence, is to bring the ego and the persona closer to this totality, which ultimately leads to a full and authentic life. Whether through methods such as therapy, introspection, personal development toward authenticity, or some combination, ultimately, for Jung, it is the task of the individual to determine and strive toward this. In all cases, this type of self-actualization requires an effort at radical self-acceptance, and radical self-acceptance requires an effort at radical honesty with oneself. To actively enter into the reality that every opportunity one takes to examine a personal feeling, thought, or action, one must attempt to do so by accepting the whole and, at the same time, often undesirable potentiality that it indicates about oneself, that they are not always who they think or expect to be. Each of these opportunities, whether personal or professional, is like a small step down the ladder into the unconscious. As one moves further down and faces these deeper, darker elements of their being hidden in the basement, they must, in Jungian terms, work to integrate their shadow, the breadth of their possible faults and evil, rather than rushing back up the stairs in denial. The shadow of one's self does not disappear when you look away from it, in the same way that one cannot literally evade the shadow cast by one's body by running faster than it. There is no movement or evasive tactic that separates the individual from their psychological shadow. The danger, rather, lies in the attempt to do so in ignorance and denial of it. Jung wrote, "The good does not become better by being exaggerated but worse, and a small evil becomes a great one by being ignored and repressed." The shadow is a very real part of human nature, and it is only at night when there are no shadows. The awareness of our dark side allows us to manage and recognize it more appropriately when it sneaks up the stairs uninvited. One must know a problem to be able to solve it, and it is an act of healing to admit that one is sick. Although self-acceptance and authenticity may sound simple and obvious, the act of actually working toward radical self-acceptance and individuation is, of course, far from simple and obvious. In the absolute sense, it is almost certainly impossible. In an above-average sense, however, it is perhaps the greatest and most difficult endeavor in life, to truly and honestly accept your flaws, weaknesses, potential evils, and shameful or unpopular interests and qualities, to admit what you see, fear, or hate in others and that it might be within you, to admit to yourself that you are not, and will never be, completely who you think and want to be, and to face the fact that your mind has worked a lifetime to hide from itself. This is a task that literally shakes the very core of the psyche. However, perhaps it is proportionally essential for a full and complete life. Just as Jung wrote, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But you must remember that every human life has potential, and if that potential is not fulfilled, then that life will have been wasted. Remember to subscribe and hit the like button for more videos and to help us reach more people.